Well, good evening and welcome back to the Journey Home program. I'm your host, John Mark Grodi, filling in for my father, Marcus. He'll be back next week. And once again, we have this wonderful opportunity here on EWTN to bring to you another wonderful story. The story of how our Lord has brought another individual home to the fullness of truth in His Catholic Church. And a very interesting story today. I'm joined by Zubair Simonson. Zubair, welcome to the show.
Good to meet you, John Mark.
Zubair, you come from a different background than many of our usual guests.
Yeah, I did. So I was raised Muslim.
Yeah.
I was born in Massachusetts. My mother moved here from Pakistan, and my father moved there from Michigan, which is where he grew up. And his mother was Catholic. His father was Lutheran, but he was a convert to Islam. So I was born in Massachusetts, raised Muslim. When I was 6 years old, my family moved to North Carolina, which is where I primarily grew up. Our household was, I'd say, fairly moderate Muslim. But when I was starting, so I also went to Sunday school. We couldn't have Fridays off because we actually had school.
Yeah.
So we had Sunday school just like the Christians. And it was there that I kind of began as a child, first having questions about Islam. The Sunday school instructors, they were on the stricter side.
Okay.
And I was taught a lot of great things, such as how to pray 5 times a day. From the age of 10, I began fasting during Ramadan. And then also, I began learning from the Sunday school instructor a lot of the details.
Yeah.
Such as one particular night, we had I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, but all the boys were sleeping over at the mosque. And it was on the Friday night. And our instructors would kind of go up and down and make sure that all the boys were sleeping on their backs rather than on their stomach. Reason being that, well, it's recorded that Muhammad would sleep on his back, and we have to imitate the life of Muhammad as much as possible, as closely as possible.
Interesting.
And so, since he did it, we need you to do it too, type thing. And that was kind of one of those early things where, as a child, I just kind of wondered, well, what does that even matter?
Right.
Type thing. And there's 1.4 billion Muslims, so there's great variation on how you're going to interpret that. In our household, it's pretty much about as innocuous as an interpretation as you could have.
Okay.
But I noticed, growing up, a lot of our fellow Muslims, who had many of whom had immigrated from the Middle East, they had kind of some very much stricter interpretations, to the point where it's often hostility. They would often have hostility toward the greater community, the country that we live in, type thing. There were a lot of sentiments that were being tossed around about how awful American foreign policy was, and that could be spoken during the khutbahs. Khutbah is the equivalent of a sermon that we would have on the Friday prayers. And I began having questions about, okay, am I able to be a good American type thing? Because, I had a father who was born in the United States. His parents' generation were all World War II generation. I'm incredibly proud of what they had done. So it's like, I want to be a good American. I want to be a normal American kid. But at the same time, there's and my family told me, very moderate, it's like, yeah, you can be both, of course. But then there was also this voice that I was often hearing from our mosque, from so many fellow Muslims, which is much more common than a lot of politically correct types would really, really like to admit, saying no, you have to be Muslim. You cannot be a good Muslim and an American, because just look at the culture all around type thing, how degenerate it can be. And, Christians have many of the same objections to the culture, and I can't blame them there. But then but when it starts going so far as well, we're the good people in this very degenerate society type thing. To the point where it's our neighbors are evil type thing. That was also a common voice, and just kind of it began becoming more and more of a conflict as I was in my teens. And I was wondering, like, why did so many of these guys move to a country that they hate so much? And, you know, like within my family, we had objections to a lot of Israel's foreign policy. Yeah. But the thing is, like, and that's common throughout the whole Muslim world. It's like, well, look at seeing Israel as more or less an apartheid state for the Palestinians. Sure. But then often there's like, some of the Muslim peers would kind of go even further, push it even further, where it's like, it's not just Israel, it's the Jews. Sure. The Jews are always conspiring against us. Yeah. And there's conspiracy theories that are being tossed around so often, where it's like, you'd think that all they ever do in Langley is sit at the board, smoking cigars, talking about how we can keep the Muslims down, type thing. And there's this obsession about like, well, why is there so much trouble throughout the Muslim world? Whereas we have this early history where Muhammad and the Sahaba being like the earliest generations, his companions in the earliest generations, they conquered everything, and they had this grand civilization which thrived for hundreds of years. And look at where we are now, and there's something lost. There's something we need to regain to be properly Muslim again, so that we can have that glory. And I think so much of the resentment of the United States is not just about Israel, it's that this country is in the place of power where we're supposed to be.
Gotcha. And before you go on, and I don't fully understand it, so you know, to help us to understand here, in terms of your living out of the Muslim faith at that age, what was your spirituality like? What was your relationship or idea to God? I mean, certainly you had the forms, the things you were learning about Muslim, but in terms of your interior life, where were you with God?
So, what Islam means submission, and what it ultimately gears you toward is to become a servant of God. And some would say, well, maybe even a slave of God. Where your duty is to obey. God is always right. And then we have the example of Muhammad to follow, type thing. And, you know, some people will imitate him loosely, follow the 5 pillars of Islam as we were told to do. 5 pillars being to pray the 5 daily prayers, to fast during Ramadan, to one time in your life, go to do a pilgrimage to Mecca, to pay alms. It's about 1/40th of your income, 2.5%, and the declaration of faith. So, you know, and within my household, my understanding was like, okay, we do these things to please God, and then, you know, we also, that was within the household, and it was like, you know, fairly like loose, moderate interpretation, but still pious. From the age of 10, I began fasting during Ramadan. This was my own choice. It wasn't something Mom and Dad made me do. It's something that's like, hey, I want to do this. And it actually is one of these things where it's like, my mother wasn't always consistent about fasting during Ramadan. And she kind of says like, well, if my 10-year-old son's doing it, then I got to get back. I got to get up to speed with this. You know, a lot of the reason I did a lot of the things that I did do, not so much out of a love for God, but out of a fear for God also, where it's like, okay, well, if I'm not good, then I'm going to get punished. And the thing is, I don't want to like just say, well, this is simply like the way Islam always teaches you. Because this is not something that's exclusive to Islam. You could be a Christian and just think like, well, I don't want to go to hell, so I'm gonna go to church each week.
Check those boxes.
But as far as having like a relationship with God, seeing God as a friend, that was pretty much non-existent there. It's like, God is my creator, and I owe him my obedience. That's...
Yeah, our guest, I was just going to say it again for the radio, our guest's name is Zubair Simonson, a former Muslim. So again, you took it seriously as you were able, and you grappled with it, the practices, but then also with some of the examples you were seeing, those set up growing questions in your mind.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, so God was some kind of entity or being that I obey, but also I learned about Sufism when I was probably 16, 17 years old, and it's this idea of these. There's some idea in there of being close to God, which has this tremendous amount of appeal. It's like, well, wouldn't it be great to like know God personally, type thing? Wouldn't it be great if there's some kind of religion which actually encourages that? And Sufism's, like, Muslims, there's a range of how Muslims view Sufism. Some, yeah, it's great. Others, it's like, and you'll see like from bombings of Sufi shrines throughout the Muslim world, it's like, no, this is things that were added on from what the pure version of Islam was, and it needs to be cast out, type thing. So there's a range, but I was among those who had a great fascination with it. My family's the type that would have a great appreciation for a lot of the Sufi poetry. We even had a family friend who was killed in Pan Am Flight 73, which is a hijacking in Karachi in 1986. Wow. So, and he was a man who was very outspoken about his sympathy for the Palestinian people. And the thing is, and then he was just shot down by Palestinian terrorists. They didn't care. He was coming from a conference which he spoke very sympathetically in Bombay about it. They didn't care. And so the thing is, it's like, okay, well, what is Islam? And I kept telling myself, it's like, okay, well, I'm practicing it right. I'm praying 5 times a day. Not exactly at the time I'm supposed to, but like, I'm doing all of them at least to get, when I'm not able to pray the daytime, the noon prayer, okay, I'll make up for it by praying it at night, but making sure those 5 prayers are said. I'm fasting during Ramadan. For the most part, my understanding was, okay, there's an angel over my right shoulder who's jotting down all of my good deeds. There's an angel over my left shoulder who's jotting down all of my bad deeds. I need to make sure this guy has more written down. And fortunately for me, when I do my pilgrimage to Mecca, then his record's going to get erased, and I get a fresh start there. We keep this guy's record. And the goal was, okay, I want to make sure I get all the bad things out of my system. So maybe I'll go and do my pilgrimage sometime when I'm like in my 30s, 40s, when it's like a little more stable. And it's like I got all the sins, all the youthful sins out of the way. Oh, by the way, all right. It was inevitably going to be brought up that I go to college during this journey. And some months back, I was invited to be on this show and told I was going to be flown to a town, Columbus, Ohio. And then I immediately realized, okay, you know what? If you're going to be bringing me to the enemy's territory, I've got to wear something to represent my alma mater and go blue.
We'll let it go.
So classes began September 4th, 2001. And we know what happened a week later. And it was, I was in Urdu class. So we had to take 2 years of a foreign language. Urdu's the native language in Pakistan, so I'm pretty familiar with it. So I got to take that as my 2 years as the Easy A. It was in that, and I remember the first thing I heard that something had happened was one of the students, and she wore the hijab, the headscarf. She said, like, as I was leaving, my roommate said, like, a missile had hit the Empire State Building, and she just kind of rolls her eyes, and it's like, you know who they're going to blame for this one, type thing. And it's like, it seems like kind of, she was rather indifferent about, like, hey, what might have happened? And throughout the whole class, it's like I couldn't focus. It's like, well, wait, did something awful happen? Did something terrible happen? And it's so class is up in an hour. I go over to the Michigan Union where there's, a few TVs that everyone can see, and everyone's crowded around this TV. And it wasn't the Empire State Building. It wasn't a missile. Its planes had struck. I guess she would have left probably when the first plane had struck the first tower. A plane had struck another tower. And by that time, one of the towers had already collapsed. And just kind of watched on the TV, watched the second tower eventually come crumbling down as well. then more reports like, okay, there was the Pentagon just got hit. Another plane crashed in Pennsylvania. It's like, okay, what's going on? Type thing. And we knew, like, you know, even though I knew even then, it's like, we know who did this type thing. And your country's attacked. That's something that like all of us can remember very vividly who were there that day. But then like, you know, to add to the bitterness, it's like the people that did the attacking were people from my faith. And it's just kind of like the first time the question got brought up. It's like, wait, are we the bad guys? Type thing. And, you know, there were, and how the Muslim community reacted also that varies. There were some people that are every bit as upset as I was. It's like, okay, your patriotic sentiments come up. I mean, I remember my aunt, she's just like, they make me so embarrassed, these guys, about my religion type thing. And understood like what a horrible thing had happened. And then also there was some other Muslims who were just kind of seemed more concerned about like, what's going to be the fallback for us,
the
type thing. And like I went to the Friday prayers in Ann Arbor that Friday, the September 14th, and they had a police officer there to make sure that none of us were harassed or bothered by anyone. But still, the khutbah, the equivalent of the sermon, there were parts where the guys just says like, yes, this was a terrible thing, but look at the plight of Muslims all around, I think. The khutbahs are so often politically driven because Muhammad was a political figure. I mean, the idea of separation, any separation between mosque and any reforms that would lead to separation between the mosque and state, they're very complicated by the fact that like, okay, the man whose life we need to imitate as much closely as possible. Yes, he was a religious figure, but he's also a political figure.
Right.
But so there's just a lot of political drivel that often comes up in these khutbahs. But he wouldn't let it go. Not of all weeks. Can't you just let it go this week? That thing. But you know, I continued being Muslim. Still fasted during Ramadan. I mean, I was probably one of the few Muslims within the college community there that was actually supportive of the invasion of Iraq, and you know, carried on with my religion. But also, the interesting thing about college is that's where a lot of my conservative instincts began awakening. I think I was like going into University of Michigan. It started out like, I guess I'm a Democrat. By the end, I walked out a Republican sympathizer. This was during the era of a Supreme Court case, Grutter versus Bollinger, which was about the affirmative action policy at the University of Michigan Law School that eventually made its way up to all the way up to the Supreme Court, you know, political correctness was a big thing then, and on college campuses throughout the country, it's gotten even bigger. And this is one of the things where I guess I was being kind of a contrarian, where it's like, you know, the idiot 18, 19-year-old thinks like, well, you know what? I disagree because I'm smarter than all of you, and I'm going to figure out why I disagree. When you talk about this topic, they were just actually repeating what all the other people were saying around them. And because, you know, well, this is, I think somewhere deep inside the head, there's that thought that this is what smart people are supposed to think. So this is what I need to agree with. And this has gotten more and more. And, you know, like a diversity and inclusion are great things. But the way that the university was, you know, if you want to have true inclusion, it has to come from the heart. And that can take a very long time. It's we want diversity now. And in that rush, the wanting it right now, the methods can become very sloppy. And I think like, you know, what was what the university was doing wrong was actually just in that rush, coming from that rush, that wanting a good thing right now. And, that's not just, that can be for anything.
Right.
And so I kind of began questioning that and kind of realizing that, okay, very intelligent people can also parrot. Very intelligent people can be manipulated.
Yeah.
And it's like, so many people who give into the politically correct camp, they want to be good people.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the person who says, I'm a good person, can be the easiest in the entire world to manipulate, because to maintain that thought that, okay, I'm a good person, I'll believe whatever it takes to be a good person, to be one of those people on the right side of history, then I'll believe anything. Okay, sure, there's 80 genders. Okay, sure. Things that kind of run away from common sense type thing.
It's a great point, especially in our ever more media-driven age, that we do tend to think it's a counterintuitive point. C.S. Lewis makes this point in the third of his space trilogy, that Hideous Strength. They have a couple of the characters, and I can't quote them, but they're talking about this exact point where our intuition on the onset would tell us, well, the very well-educated, they're not going to be swayed by the newspapers or the headlines of the weeklies, but that intelligence, that learning has to go along with virtue. Otherwise, you're even more prone to being moved by those things, because there's this sense of, well, I need to stay with the in crowd, or with the intelligentsia, or this is what the good people do or believe.
Yeah.
And so, that it's a really important point, because we're all, I think in Lewis's time, there was more of a distinction between maybe the people, the more well-read and the common man. Today, we're all kind of in that class. We've all most of us have all had basic education. We all have access to the internet. And so it's very easy to think, well, I'm above that influence, when we're all in that soup.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, it should also be noted, I didn't have cable TV growing up in the household when I was a kid. So college was the first time I had access to cable, which included Comedy Central, and which included South Park. Okay. And that's college is when I discovered my love for the show, which just regularly pans the PC camp type thing. So I'm that one guy who actually walked out of the University of Michigan a Republican sympathizer.
Very interesting.
And it never occurred to me that, it occurred to me during college, somewhere in this conservative view, we see that there's things that are actually worth preserving. But I was not really ready at that point to say, like, oh, well, the Judeo-Christian roots. Right. Well, that's just happenstance, was my thought.
There was a crack in the armor, open to further.
Well, I mean, it's Christianity didn't make sense. It's like, okay, well, why would God need a son? I think. What's this Holy Spirit you keep talking about? And this 3 persons and 1 God. It seems like really bad math is what you guys believe in. So the Christianity just doesn't make sense. Like, most of my friends are Christian, at least culturally Christian. Yeah. But I mean, it's go ahead, have your religion. It's like, but I would, I'm kind of smarter than that to join that camp.
Well, that's a good place for a break. So again, you have this upbringing, engaged in the faith, but some questions in the background, and then this college experience, and again, not having much sense to make of Christianity yet, but some openness there given your experiences. We'll come back to that in just a minute here. We're going to take a break. Again, we're here tonight with Zubair Simonson, a former Muslim, and he's sharing his exciting story with us. So come back in a few minutes. We'll hear the rest of it. Thank you. Welcome back to the Journey Home program. We're joined tonight by Zubair Simonson. We've just heard the first half of his amazing story, his upbringing as a Muslim American. And when we left off his story, he'd just been to college, he's come out of it. He's interesting mixture of views given his experiences. And you were just telling us about, at that point, Christianity, as you saw it, at least the experiences, the people you'd known, didn't make any sense to you at this point. Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
I'm since my father's a convert and his mother was Catholic, his father was Lutheran. I actually also had far more exposure to Christianity. Like every Christmas, I would go along with Grandma. The family would go with Grandma to the Catholic Mass type thing. So it's not something alien. And during a good number of summers, I'd go to the summer day camp at a Methodist church type thing, and we'd sing the songs about Jesus and God, like He's got the whole world in His hands. And it kind of. I did even note as a kid that, like, why are the instructors at this Methodist church so nice? And why are so many of our instructors at our mosque at Sunday school so harsh? But, so I am an exception from a lot of the experience of a lot of Muslims in the sense that I've had much more exposure.
That's really fascinating.
And then, but continued being Muslim throughout college. Summer of 2003, we actually... I was in D.C. for that summer for interning. And I'd found actually a program which housed Muslims throughout the summer. And it was in the Georgetown area, a very swanky neighborhood. And the thing is, it's like, okay, so we had some place to stay while we're interning. But in return, we were supposed to talk about Muslim topics each night. I mean, we usually had a speaker. And there's one particular night. This was one of the best summers of my life, and I had a blast. I had such a great time with all of the fellow Muslims there. But there was one night which actually disturbed me a great deal, and we didn't have a speaker that night. And so for the evening, we were actually going to have a discussion, and the discussion was, well, should apostates from Islam be killed, executed, as is prescribed by Sharia law. Thing is, and a lot of these fellow Muslims, we are all attending prestigious colleges like University of Texas, UCLA. We had a guy from Yale, and I was very outspoken that it's like I don't think we should even be having this type of conversation. This is beneath us type thing. We're Americans. We believe in freedom type thing. And none of the fellow Muslims ever said that like we should kill the apostates, but they did engage in a serious discussion about this. Where it's like, well, it might be kind of harsh. It might have been the proper punishment in that day, but it's kind of seen as a bit harsh in our day. So there's other ways to punish him, and it's like we're even actually engaging in this type of discussion. Kept going through my head, and. This discussion would take a much more personal turn some years later, and that what you were really discussing is whether I should be killed or not. I attended one last khutbah at our mosque, and we had a guest speaker doing the khutbah, the sermon, and at some point he made the complaint. This is 2 years into the Iraq War. Well, is complaining about the U.S. government. Which is not normal for some of the speakers, and he said something that really upset me, which should upset anyone, where it's the complaint that, well, the United States government prevents Muslim American men from serving their jihad in Iraq, that thing, and it's, okay, now that's getting on sedition there. I'm never going back to that mosque again. I actually never did. So I can kind of see that, like, okay, well, there's the way we practice Islam, but there's like all these other voices that are making me like wonder, like, oh, can I really say that they're not Muslim? Type thing. I'm wondering that. I eventually moved to New York, and I'm one of these guys that with a big starry eyes, like, okay, I'm gonna move to New York. I'm going to become a published writer. I'm going to get a great job and make lots of money. And maybe down the line, I'll run for office. And then, but with barely having any skills, just a little bit out of college. And the great thing about the city is it knocks down a guy like that a few pegs pretty quickly. So eventually, I got a job with a marketing company. And It started out as part-time, but eventually became my full-time job. And our clients were film production companies and Broadway shows. And I actually had the opportunity to meet a good number of celebrities type thing. This is like, okay, finally I got a job which is putting me on the right direction, giving me like, putting me in touch with people like I can't actually stand as friends. I can never be friends with, but people that like, can help give me what I want. So a network.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was at the same time working for the head of the office was a man who would lie a lot, so often that as you got to know him, you'd kind of wonder. It's like, does he even know what's going on anymore? Type thing. Can a man lie so much that he loses touch with reality?
Right.
And we're going to get back to that, but the moment that I decided to stop becoming a Muslim, I remember that. I was in New York, walking through Times Square, and on the news ticker, there was an announcement about the bombing of the Al-Askari shrine in Iraq, which is a big Shia mosque that was bombed by Sunni terrorists type thing. And then for some reason, it was when I was reading that news on that ticker, all of a sudden it kind of comes to me. It's like all those memories of like the guy speaking sedition, the apostate conversation, 9/11, making us guard the camp from the phantom enemies. Yeah. All of it hit all at once. Yeah. And I realized that like, okay, yes, we were very much practicing Islam, but these guys are also practicing Islam because Muhammad had a very complex life. Right. And that like, at some point, early on in his ministry, when the community was small, it was expedient to be very peaceful and to be a very peace-loving person. But then, at some point, that community grew and grew and grew, where it's like, okay, to the point where, well, we can actually make conquests type thing. And it might be like some man who was actually a spiritual genius all of a sudden gave in the temptation to hold that power. And you can't, I don't see Muhammad as a bad person for doing that. I just see him as a person because, if you could see all the cities in the world and someone said, that can be yours.
Like Christ's temptation.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's like, well, doesn't that sound great? Can you really blame a man for giving into the temptation? And it's you have to have incredible strength not to give in to that temptation.
Especially a religious figure, because or a person of principle, because the temptation is I can do good with this power. If I have the power, I can make it better. That temptation is almost more so for one who has the temptation to be a man of God. That temptation increases.
Yeah. But I mean, that's why at some point you'll see revelations in the Quran where it's like, okay, there's these very peace-loving verses, but then there's also these ones that, a lot of us, it doesn't settle very well with, where it's like, go out and conquer them all type thing. And the fact is, yes, we were Muslim, but these guys doing these terrible things, they're also Muslim. It really depends on which part of Muhammad's life you want to focus on and live by. And he's lived a complex enough life where it's like you can have either one. Right. But these guys are Muslim too. And all those memories rush back. And it's like those Sunday school instructors that I thought were so harsh, they were actually Muslim too. And that was the point where I just told myself, I don't want to be Muslim anymore. That's it. I'm done. And so I still believed in God type thing. But it was kind of probably closer. If I was going to read a book about God, it's probably something I would pick out from the shelf, from self-help or a New Age type thing. Kind of like, a hippie version where there's not really any sin. And at the same time, I'm working for this marketing company. For a man who's just left and right, I don't want to get into too many details, but engaging in a lot of unethical practices. A man who, he liked much younger guys and was like making passes at some of us, including myself, at the office type thing, which made for a whole awkward situation. And then, and at the same time, he was the type of person who could throw a tantrum one day and then recollect the next day how super calm he was and how he had to make sure all of us were calm. We all looked to him for leadership. And he believed it. And someone who would throw someone under the bus. And when that happens, it's like, okay, well, this is a job that's helping me get on my way to where I want to be. Yeah. And it's like, so it's going to be hard pressed to find another job like that with these opportunities. And at the same time, it's like, I have to look away. And it's like, when someone gets thrown under the bus, just have to go along with it. And at the same time, constantly I'm worrying. It's like, well, at what point am I going to be the one that gets thrown under the bus? Right. Type thing. And the fact is, I had no spiritual rudder anymore to make sense of it. Yeah. I think I took a trip back home to North Carolina for a week sometime. I think it was in July or August of 2006. And then I dreaded, I was depressed that whole week because I knew I was going to go back to New York and and have to deal with this environment. Right. So then eventually, it was in January 2007, I'd become this really spineless person. And the friends I had were like, anyone could be my friend. I wasn't very selective type thing, so I wasn't keeping the best company. Right. I'd probably done more hard partying early on in New York than I ever did in college type thing. Yeah. And I was 24 years old and just kind of walking along the Hudson River and thinking to myself, like, I don't like my life. I don't. And I'm going to have to live the rest of my life like this. It's like, that's something I don't want. Yeah. And it's just kind of walking along the Hudson some January day. Yeah. I hated the person I'd become. Hurling myself into the Hudson River seemed to be like a good idea or something. And then amidst all those existential type thoughts, all of a sudden the idea born again popped into my mind. And the thing is, okay, I had enough contact with like those crazy preachers on the street yelling on their megaphones and whatnot. And it's like, okay, I want nothing to do with them. Right. But just the idea flashed. Yeah. And it's like, I thought, like, where the hell did that idea come from? And for the first time, it's actually something that had appeal because the idea of a fresh start type thing. I don't have to be this person. I can be someone with a clean slate, a fresh start. It just sounded so good type thing. So I went to Barnes & Noble, I picked up a book, and even though I'm usually pretentious with what the books I select, it was The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren type thing. And I figured, like, okay, what's this born again stuff all about? Sure. So I began reading that book, and it kind of encouraged me to read the Bible. And it's like, well, you know what? I've read so many books, and so much of Western literature is so influenced by the Bible. Like, even from a secular standpoint, it makes sense to read the Bible and see what it's all about. And I also picked up Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And it's like, okay, I want to learn the basics. Yeah. And it was in that book that I encountered for the first time a very bluntly stated, Jesus is God. And then it's like, okay, I'd always heard the Son of God, Son of God, Son of God. And always heard this weird 3-person, 1-person, bad math thing. But it was the first time that it was just stated that boldly. And I just kind of like jumped back. And it's like, no. How can a man be God? That thing. And it was sometime in April. It's like I was kind of going on in my studies. And I remember walking somewhere on some sidewalk in New York, sometime in, I think it was around April of 2007. And I kind of realized, I actually believe Jesus is God. And the thing is, I think I've actually believed this for some number of weeks now. Interesting. And I'm still reading the Bible. It took 3 months to get the whole first reading done, but I have no idea when that switch might have happened.
So you read that or you experienced that, but then you begin to find that resonated in some deep way.
I mean, I knew what the next step was. I guess I got to get baptized. Yeah. And I began attending church services, a mass, actually, at St. Patrick's Cathedral. I don't really know any other churches to go to, but there's a big one right there in Midtown. So I would go to the Sunday noon mass. And then I figured like, okay, I got to get baptized. And the thing is, I didn't know anything about RCIA, or I knew that there was some difference between Catholics and Protestants.
Yeah.
And, I knew that, okay, for some reason there's a pope, there's their leader.
Yeah.
I don't really know the actual theological differences. So one church is as good as the other.
Yeah.
And I did a good Google search, and I looked for a church that would baptize me as soon as possible, type thing. RCIA is a long process, but here's one where I could just go to the baptism, 1 hour baptism class, show up that day, good, I'm a Christian, type thing. So I impulsively got baptized in June of 2007, type thing.
Okay.
And eventually I did leave that company on extremely, very hostile terms. And the next year and a half, this was October 2007, was when I left. And the next year and a half was a real financial struggle where it's, okay, my employer for 2 years, I can't get a glowing review. And it's around a time where like a lot of companies aren't really hiring. We just had a bit of a financial glitch. And so I was kind of struggling financially. And I was also kind of at the same time, learning more and more, picking up more and more books about my about the religion I had just joined and barely knew anything about, type thing. And that was actually at some point I'd encountered some tidbit about how C.S. Lewis read this book, The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. And it's like, and it was actually kind of one of the books that baptized his mind, you would say, that made him realize that, like, okay, Christians are very intelligent people. So I figured, like, okay, well, I guess I had to pick this book up, which I did. And I went through a reading, and it was like the first time that it really sunk in that it's like, okay, a lot of what Christianity has to say is actually a very intelligent position, from a very intelligent position. And The Everlasting Man, it's a book, pretty much a response, as I understand, to H.G. Wells' Outline of History, but which is a very secular telling of history. But this is one that puts Christ at the center. And this is like a way to look at so many of the paradoxes within the Christian faith, and just to even look at events, things that you would never have realized to give a second thought to. And it was a mind-jumbling book.
That tends to be the experience of reading Chesterton often.
But eventually I joined a Presbyterian church, Redeemer Presbyterian. And because they had a great speaker. There's one Sunday where it's like I wasn't available at noon to go to the St. Patrick's. So I'll go to this church, Redeemer Presbyterian, that a lot of my friends had talked about. And they had this great speaker, Tim Keller. I saw his sermon for the first time, and I figured, okay, I'm going to go to this church. I found my church home, that thing. I was also going to a worship service, and it was in January 2008. It was a worship service followed by a Bible study, a group called The Haven, pretty much like, Christian artists that would meet every Monday. And I'd impulsively become a Christian. I was learning more and more about it, but there was a moment there where I realized that, like, okay, this change of heart is actually going to be sinking in much more than I realized. At some point, there was a young man like myself, maybe 25, 26 years old, and between the worship songs, he read from John 15, and it was, I am the vine, you are the branches, type thing. And eventually Jesus says, like, I call you my friends. And a lot of the things, this that just fascinated me, drew me so much into Sufism, the fascination with Sufism was exactly that. It's like, wait, we can be near to God because, and it's the incarnation is the reason that we can be. And I heard those words and I began crying. And I knew then, at that moment, that it's like, okay, this is actually something that's going to really change me. I made such a great community at Redeemer Presbyterian, but eventually it was in New York, and what happened was what was inevitably going to happen. So many people move in and out of the city. I moved out of the city last year. I was one of those people. It's such a transient place. And like so many of the friends I'd made, well, they moved off to different places, or they went off to different churches. And pretty soon I was by myself at Redeemer Presbyterian. And I noticed a lot of things. I noticed, like, okay, Tim Keller's getting up there in the years, and you can kind of see that a lot of the preachers, the pastors there, were trying to scramble and figure out, like, okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to do when he's retired? Because we could be in big trouble. Once we have this charismatic speaker retire, our attendance could take a nosedive. And then, so I was thinking, like, well, wouldn't it be nice if you had like a consistent priesthood, maybe one that goes all the way back 2,000 years, type thing, which could just keep going, keep the church running, no matter how charismatic a speaker happens to be at the same time. A lot of the reading I continued doing. A lot of the books that got me thinking, books by guys like Walker Percy, more by G.K. Chesterton, E.F. Schumacher, Peter Kreeft. I noticed that the vast majority of cases, the author that really draws me happens to be Catholic. And in fact, this G.K. Chesterton guy converted to the Catholic Church. I began noticing, like, okay, when I went to a Catholic church, I had a lot of discomfort with statues being there. But, you know, like, as I was attending the Presbyterian church, eventually that conditioned discomfort left, and I began appreciating a lot of the beautiful art which the Catholic Church again and again kept maintaining. And so eventually I was kind of at a point where it's like, and plus what I was hearing at the Presbyterian church about salvation, I learned all about salvation. But I was wondering, what's beyond salvation? Is there something more? And a change was coming. And I remember the moment, I was thinking, like, should I become a Catholic? And that the moment I finally made the decision, I'm going to become Catholic, was in September 2010. I went to a church to pray. The great thing about Catholic churches is that they keep their doors open so you can pray. But this particular day, I wanted to, have some quiet time with God, and I went to the pews. But there's this woman in the back of the church, and she's just crying. It's like a homeless woman, crying, makes so much noise. And I was at the church trying to pray, but I have this big distraction. It's like, well, is anyone going to shut her up? And eventually, the man with security came up to her. And I was kind of watching from the corner of my eye, like, I wonder what he's going to do, type thing. And you know what he did?
What?
He hugged her. And she went quiet, just like that. And there's all, just like that. And I'm kind of watching it from the corner of the eye. And it's, there's this question, should I join the Catholic Church? There's so many things I've actually learned to love about it. And that was the moment where it's like watching it from the corner of the eye, and where it's answered, it's, I guess I'm going to be joining the Catholic Church.
Interesting. Yeah.
Of course, like, this was a lot of the Protestant friends had kind of a lot of reservations about the Catholic Church. I had heard early on from one of the junior pastors at Redeemer, where it's like this fun fact. It's like, do you know when the Catholics, when they do their communion, they actually believe that they're consuming the body and blood of Jesus? And I heard that, it's like, oh, that's really bizarre that they would believe that. And there's the allegations. It's like, okay, Catholics worship saints. The Catholic Church is not biblical, type thing. Only problem was, I was reading the Bible, and I was actually encountering, like, so many of these sacraments. And then the case for the Pope, I realized, was actually quite strong, where it's very clear that Jesus gave a leadership role among the apostles to St. Peter. But then, for us, it was like a one-time thing. Oh yeah, he was the leader among the apostles, but the apostles were just these once in a lifetime, this once lifetime guys. But then, like, if you read the book of Acts, the first thing that the apostles do was that, they're drawing lots to figure out
they have a council.
Who's going to be the replacement for Judas.
Right.
And okay, well, if they're doing that, then it seems like they're actually not just one-time guys, that they're actually establishing offices. And then if they were establishing offices, then who holds the office of Peter?
Yeah.
And okay, every Catholic knows that. It was like, well, yeah, of course, today would be Pope Francis.
Right.
That thing. I realized like a lot of the allegations about the Catholic Church, like that we worship saints and Mary, read into that, it's like, no, the saints are not, that's actually very flimsy type thing. That can be broken down and explained very quickly. It's like, no, don't worship Mary. I don't worship the saints in that sense. They're not part of the Holy Trinity. But just as I can go to you and say, hey, John Mark, I'm really hoping for this, or I'm really struggling with this. Would you please pray for me? You can do the exact same thing with these people who are in heaven, and even with the Mother of God. The sacraments, like that really bizarre thing where he holds up the bread and says, "This is my body, eat." This is holds up the chalice, says, "This is my blood, drink from it." Well, maybe it should be taken literally, is my thought, because for some reason, if I could ask, like, okay, do we believe that Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding at Cana? Yes.
Right.
Do we believe that Jesus multiplied the loaves and the fishes? Yes.
Or
do we believe
true God and true man? You know, when you look at him. Yeah.
And then do we believe that he actually meant he meant just that when he held up that bread and wine? It's like, no.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's like, why not?
Yeah.
Why don't we believe that? Why do we take all this literally? But then all of a sudden it's like, okay, we're putting that to a standstill here.
Right.
And I started realizing the case for this bizarre thing where they actually believe they're consuming the blood and the body and blood of our Lord. It's actually right there in the Bible.
Right.
Type thing. And then that's kind of the idea. It's like, wait, I've been going to Redeemer Presbyterian because they have great worship and it makes you feel good, because they have an outstanding speaker who makes you think. And it's great to feel good, it's great to think. But at that Mass, regardless of what the worship service is like, if it's like tone-deaf choir, where the music only sounds good when it finally makes its way to heaven, or, if like the homily, the priest has nothing that says nothing that really jogs the gears up there. That's not the point. The point is that meal, we share that meal, and the feeling and thinking are great, but in that meal, we get to become what we consume. And the being that the Catholic Church is aiming for is something far, far greater, more profound, like so much like the incarnational view that we have. The Catholic Church in the sacraments is pushing it so much further. And in the writing, it's the books that I'm reading and the writings, the authors that have been drawing me over and over. I could read in those words some elevated sense of the sacred. And it's like, where does that come from? And it's like, actually, it's because in that Catholic worldview, you push the incarnation even further with the sacraments. Like there's a miracle happening each time. We read about all these miracles in the Bible, but then for some reason it's like we can easily take for granted that like each time the priest holds up that host and says the body of Christ, a miracle's happening right there.
Right. Zubair, what an amazing journey. You covered so much. You've come from such a long way, so many interesting things. We're going to have you back because there's just so much more we could dig into.
I would love to
all
come
those
back.
Authors, Chesterton, so many neat topics. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed Zubair's story. I hope it's been an encouragement and inspiration to you. Yeah, I hope you'll, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Journey Home program. God bless.